Your nest egg versus inflation. You may not realize it, but you're in a financial battle. And if you don't plan for inflation, it will win. Here's the problem. No one knows what the inflation rate will be in the future. That's why we have to consider the past. But which set of past inflation rates do we use if we're looking for the next 20, 10, 20, and 30 years? Also, do we use actual returns or real inflation adjusted returns? Here's what I'm talking about when we talk about this. This are the actual returns for the last 50 years from 1975 on. These are the returns for the S&P 500. Now, this is the inflation rate for these different years. Notice how it's varying. Notice how, especially this 10-year period right here, the inflation rate was really high. It got up to as high as 13.5%. So that's why people like to consider what's the real return on that when you take into account inflation. So this is the formula that's used down here to come up. This is what the real return would be. For example, 1977 numbers, the stock S&P 500 return was down 7.18%. But if you take into account the inflation rate of 6.5%, you actually had a real return on your money of down 12.85%. This is a formula that we use. You're going down through here. Now, why do we not go with this? Why do I not go with this? Here's what happens. This is using the S&P 500 returns going through here, and this is actually this column right here is what you actually would have in buying power when you take into account inflation after these periods. So for example, let's look at the 20-year period. Let's just say we have these kind of returns, this kind of inflation going forward the next 20 years. You open up your statement, let's say you start with $80,000, and 20 years down the road, you open up your statement, it says you have $1.217 million. All right, I'm a millionaire. But what would the buying power of that be 20 years from now? That's what I want to show you, because here's what we have to realize. Our brains always work in today's dollars. We always have to, that's just the way we think. For example, few decades ago, $10 would fill up your gas tank. But today it takes $30 to $40. We always think of what it takes in today's dollars. So let's go ahead and look at this again. 20 years down the road, you got this 1.217 in your statement, but it's only going to have the buying power 20 years from now of 410,000 in today's dollars. We always have to think about this. This is in future dollars. This is in today's dollars. I actually got the summary chart right up here. Let's say, for example, this you carry this on for 30 years, 80,000 with the S&P 500 returns using 1975 numbers, you'd have $3.804 million. But what kind of buying power will that have 30 years from now in today's dollars? You would be a millionaire. That's everybody's goal, is to be a millionaire. You would be a millionaire on your statement as early as right here. This about 16 years in, you'd have $1 million. But what would the buying power of that be in 17 years from now? That'd be 371,000. You'd be way short of the $1 million. So if you go out 30 years and use the inflation rate of 4.58%, which is what that average would be, you would have $1,004,000. But what happens if we have a different set of inflation numbers? Let's say, for example, your inflation numbers were actually as bad as 7.64, which is what the returns were from 1985 to 1994, 1975. If you had an inflation rate like that for the next 30 years, you would need $9 million to have the same buying power as $1 million today. So which set of inflation numbers do we use? Do we use the worst case scenario or the best case scenario? This think of inflation over the next 30 years was only 2.28. 2.28. You would only need 1.975 million to have the same buying power as $1 million today. We're just kind of rounding it off to $1 million. It all depends on what you use for the inflation rate. Let's go ahead and look at a different scenario here, a different spreadsheet kind of bringing this out. Let's say, for example, there's the 80,000. And we want to look at the numbers from 1920 25, because that's what we do in this channel. We look at the numbers for the last 100 years for the S&P 500, and depending on what year you pick, shows you what you would have after these time periods. After 30 years, this 80,000 would grow to 1.452 if we had this set of returns. Of course, they're not going to be identical, but we're just kind of giving us a wide variance, wide range of what you might have. If we use 1925 numbers, after 30 years, you'd have 1.452 million. That's this column right here, folks. There's the 1.452. And what we did is set this up to run for every year. For 1926 numbers, you'd have 1.519 and so on. So the results for every single year going down through here, this is what you would have, which leads to a wide variance anywhere from the worst case scenario, 918,000 right there, up to 3.804, which ironically, it just happens to be 1975 numbers, which is what we were just looking at. Ended up with $3.804 million right here. $3.804 million. That would have the buying power of $1 million if you had the 4.58%. Again, I'm going to go back to that real quick. 4.58% inflation rate. There it is right there. There's a round off areas between that number and that number. But you would have this kind of numbers. If you invested in 1975, got these kind of returns, and if you had real inflation rates of these right here, you would have the buying power of $1 million. That's what this would have. So that's what we're looking at. Again, our brains always work in today's dollars, so we need to take that into account. We need to know what is the buying power of this future amount in today's dollars. And since we're thinking in today's dollars always, we need to know what kind of future amount that would be. So this 3.804 million in today's dollars would be worth $1 million. So hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and look at this in a little bit more detail. This shows us the $3.804 million, and I actually ran the numbers here. I actually used I actually figured out what it'd be to come out to exactly $1 million if the inflation rate was this number right here, 4.554223. On this amount right here, you would have the buying power of $1 million 30 years from now if you got these kind of sums. Now you're not going to have this is the best case scenario. If you had this right here, 1.737 million, that'd have the buying power of 456,000 with this inflation rate. Which inflation rate do we use? It makes a huge difference. If we go down to 3% inflation rate, watch the difference. Now you have the buying power of 715,000, the same 1.737, which is the median of this column. The worst case scenario, you'd have 918,000 right there. It would have the buying power of 378. So you see how that works? It all depends on what you put in here. And in this spreadsheet, we always use this rectangle right here to show you what the buying power of these different amounts are, because this is future dollars, but we need to know what it is in today's dollar. It's because our minds always work in today's dollars. So hopefully this makes sense to you. But that's what we do in this channel. We just run different numbers for people. This is so key right here. You need $1 million. What would you, if we had let's just go to a 7.64. 7.64, what if returns average inflation was 7.64 over the next 30 years? What would you need to have to get to this $1 million? You'd need $9 million with a 7.64. On the other hand, if we use a 2.28, again, 2.28 inflation rate, you'd only need $1,975,000 on your future statement, what the future statement says, to have the buying power of $1 million. That's what we do on this channel. We set up all kinds of different spreadsheets just to help you understand what your numbers might look like. You've always got to take into account inflation because it's always there. The problem with it is, as we saw, what inflation rate do you use? So if you're more conservative on your inflation rate, you'd need less to get to, but if you're higher inflation rate, you'd need a lot more. Let's just use one more. Let's use a 5.63 just to show you how this works. 5.63, which was the 20-year average, which included from here down to here, included this worst case scenario. That was a 5.63. In that case, you would need 5,194,000 to have the same buying power. Again, this is what we're looking at, trying to get to $1 million. If your inflation rate was this high, you would need this kind of money on your bank statement to have the buying power of this. But again, that's what we do on this channel. We set up spreadsheets, we run numbers just to help people just understand some concepts that you really need to be aware of, like sequence of returns risk. In this case, we looked at the impact of inflation on your money, because like we said here, our brains always work in today's dollars. And so when you see these kind of figures right here and say, man, I'm going to be rich, it all depends on which one you're looking at, which inflation rate, because you'd need this kind of money, not this kind of money, to have $1 million worth of buying power if the inflation rate was this instead of this. Please like the video, and thanks so much for watching, and hopefully this made sense to you.